Good evening. My name is Terry Yoffe, and welcome to Coach World TV. Tonight, as my guest, I have Steve Bowling.
Good
Hi,
evening.
Steve.
Good evening.
How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Good.
Pleased to be here.
Yes, Steve is founder of Just For You HR Consulting. He has over 23 years of excuse me, 23 years of human resource experience across a range of industry sectors and organizational sizes. Wow, I barely could get that out. I'm sorry. So, Steve.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here with you this evening. Looking
Thank you.
forward to talking about emotional intelligence and how you can use it both at the individual level and with teams.
So, Steve, tell us a little bit about emotional intelligence, because my feeling is a lot of people don't know about it. Okay. And if they do know about it, I'm not sure they know exactly what it is.
Okay. It's been evolving for a while now. If we go back probably about 100 years or so, people were very focused on recognizing emotions, the awareness of them, and whether we could control them or not. I think in the 1980s we had some great work by Daniel Goleman around the whole EQ model, which started to identify competencies. Some of the things you should do to be effective in emotional intelligence. And the focus was on understanding how you react to situations and people and behavior, and also trying to understand the emotions of someone else you're interacting with so that you can build a relationship and get an effective outcome. Certainly with my coaching work, I talk a lot about intent versus impact. And of course, with our behavior, we measure our own behavior by our intentions. Other people measure us by the impact that we have on them. And sometimes there's a disconnect. And that's really emotional intelligence, is that gap between your intentions and your impact with your interaction with somebody else.
So, when we talk about emotional intelligence, we're talking about the soft skills with people as opposed to the IQ and their skill set. Is that correct?
That's correct. IQ is complementary. I think people that are familiar with successful people will know they have a threshold level or a minimum level of expertise in the IQ area or functional skills. The real success is the ability to build meaningful relationships with people and coalitions with people in organizations. And that's where the soft skills, both on individual relationships and within a team environment, become really important.
So when you talk about soft skills, can you tell us a little bit what you're saying? Examples of soft skills, what they are.
Okay, one of the ones that often is used is the empathy piece.
Okay.
I think most of us would agree sympathy may not have a place in the workplace. Empathy certainly does, which is trying to understand the other person, what their point of view is, what their perspective is. To truly understand their perspective, you need to listen. So you have to have the ability to be empathetic, you have to have the ability to listen to the other person and not assume that they're wrong. Listen and decide if they're making a rational case or information that you were unaware of. The piece that's going on inside yourself, of course, is how are you reacting to how they're saying something. As we all know, it's not always what we say, it's often how we say it. And sometimes if we say it in the wrong way, it can be misinterpreted and may inflame a situation that doesn't need inflaming. And most people, if we take it away from the business world, can probably recognize that at home with important relationships, whether it be with significant others or be with children. Where something is said, but it's how it's said is the problem. And that's emotional intelligence. It's how we say something, not necessarily what we say.
So I'm just going to kind of sidebar for a minute and ask, how do you use emotional intelligence when we're in a world of email and texting as opposed to personal interaction?
It is creating some differences, clearly, but we've all received those emails that we've reacted to negatively. So although it's an emotional response to the situation, it's also how we reply. Do we reply all straight away with a scathing response, or do we sit back and wait and decide how we're going to respond? You're still using emotional intelligence, but it's not necessarily so much in the moment as it is when you're facing someone. But you still have to use that emotional intelligence about what outcome are you trying to achieve by your next email, if you decide to email, or do you go by telephone? And I've noticed a lot of the colleges more recently now, particularly in the technical engineering type schools, are offering more EQ social skills training to help their engineers become more successful when they go to the workplace, rather than just be a good technical engineer.
So let's say you get an email where you're not sure of exactly what its intention is. You know, it's very ambiguous, and you step back and you're not going to answer it right away. But is there a place to send an email to someone and say, I'm not sure what you're saying here. Could you please clarify what you're saying? So then it comes back where you're a little bit more assured of exactly what the intention of the email or the text or whatever else it is.
And I think that's particularly true in a global world, where often people are working in their second language. And therefore they're using terminology that may not be readily understood in a different context or a different culture. So you do have that piece. Time zones can create a challenge, but there is still nothing wrong with the telephone and just reconfirming exactly what the intent of the email was.
Okay.
And maybe you can then help with that individual you're dealing with and say, this is how it came across to me when I read it, just so you know for next time. I'm glad we've had the conversation so we know how we're operating. I can give you a personal example.
Sure,
I'm sure people may have worked out I'm not from the US originally.
Really?
I know it's a surprise. I know it's a surprise.
Small town in Kansas.
Alabama.
Oh, Alabama. Shucks.
But when I first moved to the US, I was working with some US colleagues, and we were dealing with an issue that needed to go to more senior level people in the organization. And I suggested that we should table it because it was important to table it. And of course I go to the meeting and start talking about it at the meeting with the senior people, because in the UK when you table something you put it on the table to discuss. And of course here you take it off.
Right.
So I was concerned and confused why my colleagues I'd been working with were a little bit frustrated with me, until we had the conversation about why I said we should table it to get a senior level person's view. They thought I was protecting them from it by not putting it on the table. So I've lived some examples myself where intention and impact are very different.
But speaking of that, I think a lot comes down to communication, where most people, you know, this is how they communicate. You think you know what they're saying and you walk away, but the truth is, you probably might not have heard, because as we all know, most of us don't listen. And I would imagine that listening is a huge communication skill. And it from what you're saying, listening is big for emotional intelligence as well.
It is. To make sure you're understanding the other person, you need to listen to their perspective and their point of view. Otherwise you will misinterpret it. And we all know we're working at 100 miles an hour.
Yes,
and therefore
that is
don't have the time to listen properly. But also we get very complacent. It's cognitive complacency is the word that's often used. Is if you're experienced, when you've seen a situation before, you expect the same thing to happen this time. And unfortunately that doesn't always happen because it's a different set of circumstances or a different person, and therefore we do get lazy and we just assume we've heard what we expect to hear rather than what we did hear. And that can be,
that's interesting.
as I'm often told, I don't have a listening problem, I have a hearing problem. Or is it the other way around?
Okay. So when we look at emotional intelligence and we look out at the business world and the business landscape and what's going on in organizations, and I love to go back to the whole collapse of the financial world with some of these leaders that were supposedly leaders in their field and yet didn't turn out that way. What can you say about how important emotional intelligence is in the business world and in helping individuals and teams work together?
That's true. And I think the thing is with emotional intelligence, sometimes it's perceived as gooey, soft, nice and fuzzy things. Emotional intelligence is not that. It's about having a conversation with somebody. It also includes having tough conversations with people. So if you take the financial collapse, it means telling someone in the organization this is the wrong thing to do because these are the implications. But having that conversation in a way that has the desired outcome of making people stop and think, are we doing the right thing? So emotional intelligence can have a hard edge to it, although you're using soft skills, because it helps you have tough conversations more effectively. And I think that's where in the business world now you're seeing organizations start to realize the value of emotional intelligence in their leaders, because it means they can have the tough conversations without ruining the relationship.
How many, when you think about organizations out there, how many I know you don't have an exact number, but how many are actually moving in the direction of bringing emotional intelligence into their organizations because they see the benefits of it?
I think, as we mentioned earlier, emotional intelligence, the concept and the competencies have been around some time.
I'm shocked that they've been around as long as they have. I only started hearing about it maybe 7 years ago, and now you're telling me they've been around for forever.
Yep, certainly for a while in terms of the concept, more detailed with Daniel Goleman's work, of course, and with the competency model. Interestingly, he did his work at Rutgers University in New Jersey, just across the Hudson River from where we're sitting.
That's true.
And I think what you're seeing now is people have been socialized with the concept. They've seen intelligent, smart people fail. And it's not because of their brain power, it's something else. And I think EQ now is becoming more accepted as one of the solutions to help smart people be also successful people.
Interesting. So we look out and we see that there are a lot of smart people out there, leaders in leadership roles, yet they don't have that other component. And it could be disastrous for a company, because I would imagine the turnover for companies that, you know, leaders come and they don't produce or they don't work out, they leave, and then they've got to bring in yet another person to take over.
There is clearly a business case in terms of people being successful in retaining and engaging employees because of the cost of recruiting and the lost productivity by having empty seats. I know with the economy, perhaps as it's been more recently, that's been less of a concern for employers, but I think the ones that are thinking ahead are now realizing there'll still be a war for talent as the new bright things come from college. As they're going into the workplace, people will want that new talent, those skills to be successful with their companies. They'll want to enjoy their work environment, which means people need to know how to lead and manage people effectively and build the right work environment. So that's going to be key. And interesting you say about the cost for businesses with the recruitment, loss of productivity, the culture that's developed, and therefore the reputation of the company can be impacted. There was some research on medical liability claims. And they did some research on doctors, and the doctors that have lower EQ based on how they interact with patients typically have higher rates of claims against them for medical liability.
Wow.
So again, there's a huge cost if you take that field particularly. And it was to do with doctors that had to be willing to listen to the patient for the first minute of an interaction rather than jumping in with a solution based on the initial conversation. And it's interesting that that's clearly a huge cost you can measure very clearly. Not so easy perhaps in the business world, but I think companies are starting to recognize the impact of not having people who are emotionally intelligent. Right. The good news, emotional intelligence is developable, if there is such a word as developable.
That was my next question. How do people in the business world start to develop? I mean, we all have innately all of these soft skills. But somehow I think we were always told or taught that when you go into business, you have to be businesslike and, you know, put on that front and be smart and get the job done. And nobody shows any kind of emotional caring. But that's changed and accepted.
Although I think you also have a scenario where if you look at the education system in most developed countries, the focus up until 18 is around getting good grades or good SAT scores, very focused on the hard skill, the knowledge base, not are you developing good social skills. If you have that, that's a bonus. But the real focus is and rewarded for getting good academic scores. That obviously later in life could be a problem for people. The IQ is pretty fixed. Our level of intelligence is pretty fixed. Our EQ is something that we can grow and develop. And you can start doing that by receiving feedback, looking at the relationships that you have. And this intent versus impact that I mentioned earlier is a really good way. If your intention is to say to somebody, I really appreciate what you did, and they go away upset, then clearly you have a disconnect. And the way you've communicated it is a problem.